Before he sold 100 million records, before the sold-out halls and the ovations that lasted longer than the songs themselves, Charles Aznavour was carrying another singer's suitcases up a narrow staircase in Paris. He was sleeping on the floor of her apartment, wrapped in a borrowed coat, listening to her voice through the wall, waiting for a single sentence that would either end his ambitions before they began or set the rest of his life in motion. The woman whose floor he slept on was Edith Piaf. She was, at that moment, the most famous voice in France, a woman who had come up from the pavement herself and knew exactly what the pavement could do to a person. And on one particular evening, sometime in the years after the war, she looked at the young man that nearly everyone else in Paris had already dismissed, and she said something so blunt, so wounding, that most people in his place would have walked out the door and never come back. She told him to change his face. Not his songs, not his voice, his face. This is the story of the years around that sentence, of how the biggest star in the country took in a small, unwanted, unfashionable young singer that no one believed in, and what she saw in him that the rest of Paris could not yet see. He was in his early 20s, the son of Armenian immigrants who had fled to France and opened a small restaurant. He was short. His voice, the thing he was staking everything on, was rough and cracked at the edges, nothing like the smooth, polished tenors that audiences of the time expected. Critics who bothered to write about him at all were unkind. One called his voice a defect. Others were worse. He had a nose that photographers did not know what to do with, a face the era considered wrong for the spotlight. He had almost no money, and yet he had one thing that was harder to see from the outside, an absolute, stubborn certainty that he was meant to write songs and sing them. When Piaf took him into her circle, she did not put him on a pedestal. She put him to work. He carried her bags. He drove through the night between shows. He ran errands, sat in on rehearsals, slept on the floor of her apartment when there was nowhere else, and wrote songs in the spare hours between all of it. To an outsider, it might have looked like she was using him. It was not that. She was watching him. She was measuring something in him that could not be measured in a single audition, the thing that decides whether a person breaks or hardens when the world tells them no. She had seen dozens of young singers with prettier voices come through her door, full of confidence, and vanish the moment the first bad review arrived. She was not interested in confidence. She was interested in whether a person would still be there in the morning, still working, after the applause had gone somewhere else. Aznavour did not break. He slept badly and ate little, and heard himself insulted in print. And in the morning he was still there, pencil in hand, another song half written on a scrap of paper. Night after night, he stayed. To understand what that sentence meant, you have to understand the Paris he was standing in. It was the late 1940s. The war was over, but the city was still catching its breath, still learning how to laugh again in rooms that had spent years being careful. The cabarets along the side streets had reopened. The music halls were filling. And into that recovering city, a certain kind of song was returning. The French chanson. The song that told a whole life in 3 minutes, that could make a room of strangers feel like they had all lost the same person. At the center of that world stood Edith Piaf. By then she was not merely popular. She was something closer to a national feeling. When she walked onto a stage in her plain black dress, small and pale under the lights, the noise of the room would simply fall away. She had already given France La Vie en Rose, a song that had traveled far past the borders of the language it was written in. She could fill the largest halls in the country, and she remembered, with a clarity that never left her, what it had been like to sing for coins on a street corner, to sleep where she could, to be nobody. That memory was the reason she kept her door open to the young performers who came looking for her. Charles Aznavour was one of the ones who came, and he did not look like someone who was going to matter. The problem was that believing in him and helping him were not the same thing, and Piaf knew it. She could put him on a stage. She could not make an audience love a face they had already decided was wrong. And in the France of that moment, the way a singer looked was not a small matter. The industry around them was blunt about it. Managers told him, more or less to his face, that he would never be a star, that his voice was a liability, and his appearance was worse. There were whispers that Piaf was wasting her time, that the young man trailing behind her was a charity case she would eventually tire of. Aznavour heard all of it. He was not a fool. He knew what he looked like, and he knew what they were saying. And the cruelest part was that some of the advice came dressed as kindness. People suggested, gently, that he stay behind the scenes, that he write songs for prettier singers, and let his voice stay off the record. It was the safe path. It was the path that would have quietly erased him. So the tension in those years was not really about talent. Everyone who listened closely could hear the talent. The tension was about whether this odd, unfashionable young man would be allowed to stand in front of a room as himself, or whether the world would sand him down into someone easier to sell. There were nights in that period when even Aznavour seemed close to accepting the safe path. He was tired. He was poor. He had been told no so many times that the word had almost stopped stinging, which is its own kind of danger. A person can survive rejection. What they rarely survive is the slow decision to stop asking. Piaf saw that danger in him more clearly than he saw it in himself. She had come too close to it once, in her own beginning, to mistake it for anything else. And then, one evening, in a plain room after another long conversation about everything he was supposedly doing wrong, she gave him her answer to the question the whole city had been asking about him. It is easy, all these years later, to say Piaf was famous and leave it there. But her importance to a young singer went far past her fame. Edith Piaf was, in the truest sense, a maker of careers. She had an ear that could hear, in a raw and unfinished performer, the artist he might become in 10 years. She had done it before, and she would do it again, opening doors for young men and women who would go on to fill the halls she was filling. When she believed in someone, she did not offer polite encouragement. She gave them the one thing that mattered more than praise, her honesty, delivered without softening. She had lived a hard life, and she had no patience for the comforting lie. If she thought a song was weak, she said so. If she thought a performer was hiding, she said so. For a young artist, standing inside that honesty was frightening, because Piaf's opinion could not be argued with. She was the proof of her own advice. She had turned herself from a street child into the voice of a nation by refusing to pretend. And she demanded the same refusal from anyone she took seriously. The cruelty some people saw in her bluntness was not cruelty at all. It was the highest form of respect she knew how to give. She only spent that kind of honesty on people she believed were worth it. And she had decided Charles Aznavour was worth it, even when he could not see it in himself. What happened next did not happen in a single night. Real transformations rarely do. But something in him shifted after that conversation, and everyone who watched his career could eventually see it. He stopped apologizing for the voice that critics had called a defect. He leaned into it. He made the roughness a feature, a way of sounding like a real person confessing a real thing, rather than a polished singer performing a pretty one. He kept writing, and the songs got better, sharper, more honest. He wrote about loneliness, about aging, about love that arrived too late or left too early. And he sang them in that cracked, unmistakable voice that no one else had. The very qualities Paris had told him to hide became the reason audiences would one day trust him completely. When Charles Aznavour finally stood in front of a full hall as himself, small and plain and entirely unlike the matinee idols of his youth, people did not see a defect. They saw someone who looked like their own lives. They saw a man singing the truth in a voice that had clearly been through something. And the ovations came, first slowly, then in a flood that would not stop for the rest of the century. The young man who had slept on Piaf's floor became one of the most beloved and successful singers France ever produced, filling the very halls where he had once carried someone else's bags. The face nobody wanted became one of the most recognized faces in the world. The moment came, as these moments often do, in an ordinary room, without ceremony. They had been talking about his prospects, about the endless advice that he change everything, tone down his voice, stay in the shadows. And Piaf, who had heard it all too, looked at him and made her position brutally clear. She did not tell him to hide. She did not tell him to give the songs away. She told him that if the only thing standing between him and the stage was his face, then he should go and change his face. It sounds shocking now, and it was blunt then. But hidden inside that harsh sentence was the opposite of everything the managers had told him. The managers wanted him gone. Piaf wanted him out front. The advice about his appearance, hard as it was, carried a message underneath it that no one else had offered him. It said, in effect, the voice stays. The songs stay. You stay. If something has to give, let it be the one thing we can actually change, and not the thing that makes you an artist. It was a terrible thing to hear, and a generous thing to mean. And Aznavour, standing in that room, had to decide how to take it. He could have heard only the insult and walked away wounded. Instead, he heard the faith buried inside it. He heard a woman who had refused to be erased telling him, in the only language she trusted, that he did not have to be erased either. Edith Piaf did not live to see the full height of it. She died young, worn down by a life that had asked too much of her body, and by the time Aznavour's greatest years arrived, she was already gone. But he never let the story go untold. For the rest of his long life, whenever people asked him how it all began, he pointed back to her. He spoke about the floor he had slept on, the bags he had carried, the bluntness that had felt like cruelty and turned out to be belief. He understood, better than anyone, that she had given him something the applauding crowds never could. She had refused to lie to him. In a city full of people telling him to disappear, one woman who knew exactly what disappearing felt like had told him to stay, in the harshest possible words, because harsh words were the only ones she trusted enough to build a person on. That is the part that is so easy to miss when you only know the famous names and the famous songs. Behind the 100 million records, there is a narrow staircase, a borrowed coat, and a young man listening through a wall for a verdict. And behind the voice of Paris, there was a woman generous enough to be cruel and clear-eyed enough to see, in a face that everyone else rejected, exactly who Charles Aznavour was going to become. He never changed that face. In the end, he made the whole world love it instead.